$10. That was the price they whispered for a human soul, a chilling echo in the stale, smoke-thickened air of the Gilded Spur Saloon. $10 for the girl huddled on the makeshift auction block, a crate still smelling of cheap whiskey and desperation. Her name, if she still owned one, was lost in the vast, unforgiving expanse that had swallowed her, a land that promised freedom but often delivered only a harsher form of bondage. She was small, fine-boned, her black hair a tangled curtain hiding a face pale with a terror so profound it had frozen into a mask of stone. Around her, the faces of men swam in a haze of lust and cruel amusement, miners, drifters, cowboys with eyes as hard as the sun-baked earth. They saw not a person, but a commodity, a diversion. The auctioneer, a portly man named Sweeney with a voice like gravel and greed, spat a brown stream of tobacco juice. "All right, gentlemen, what am I bid for this? Exotic little flower? Fresh off the boat, barely touched. $10 is the bid from Jed Barlow, a fine starting point." Jed Barlow, a thick-set man with a sneer permanently etched onto his face, grinned, his eyes crawling over the girl. He was known for his casual cruelty, a man who found sport in the suffering of others. The girl, Leanne, though no one there knew her name, squeezed her eyes shut, a silent prayer to God she wasn't sure remembered her. Each chuckle, each lewd comment, was a fresh lash against her spirit. She had been stolen, bartered, and now, sold like cattle. The air crackled with a vile energy, the anticipation of possession. Barlow raised his hand again, ready to seal the disgusting pact. Just as Sweeney was about to slam his gavel, a rusty hammer, onto the crate, the swing doors of the Gilded Spur burst inward not with a kick, but with the sudden, undeniable presence of a man who filled the frame, his shadow falling long and cool across the room. Silence descended, thick and abrupt. He was tall, lean, his clothes worn but clean, a stark contrast to the grime around him. His face, weathered by sun and wind, was etched with lines that spoke of hardship, but his eyes, a startling clear grey, held a stillness that unnerved them. This was Elias Thorne, a rancher from the high plains, a man who kept to himself, whose past was a closed book few dared try to open. He moved with a quiet purpose, his gaze sweeping over the scene, lingering for a moment on Leanne, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths, not pity, not anger, but a profound weariness. He didn't speak, just raised a hand. Sweeney, momentarily thrown, stammered, "Well now, Mr. Thorne. Didn't expect to see you gracing us." Barlow's bid is 10-inch. Elias's voice, when it came, was low, calm, like stones shifting in a riverbed. 20. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Barlow scowled. 25. Elias met his gaze. 50. The saloon was utterly silent now. $50 was a steep price, more than some of these men saw in a month. Barlow's face purpled. He knew Thorne, knew the man wasn't one for idle bids or casual cruelty. This wasn't sport for Thorne, this was something else. Sweeney, sensing the shift, looked from Thorne to Barlow. $50 from Mr. Thorne. Going once. Twice. Barlow glared, then spat on the floor. "He can have the scrawny thing. Weren't worth that much." How Sweeney slammed the hammer. "Sold. To Mr. Elias Thorne for $50. Elias stepped forward, his movements economical. He laid 5 gold coins on the crate, their clink loud in the quiet. He didn't look at Leanne then, but at Sweeney. A receipt. Sweeney scribbled one hastily. Elias took it, folded it, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. Only then did his gaze turn to the girl on the crate. He didn't reach for her. He simply said, his voice still low, "Come." Leanne flinched, her eyes, wide and dark, finally meeting his. She saw no leer, no triumph, only that same unsettling stillness. Slowly, unsteadily, she slid off the crate, her legs trembling. The silence in the saloon was heavy, laced with resentment and a grudging, fearful respect for the man who had justified their ugly game. Elias Thorne turned, and without a backward glance at the rabble, walked towards the door, Leanne a small, hesitant shadow following in his wake, stepping out of the suffocating darkness of the Gilded Spur and into the harsh, indifferent glare of the afternoon sun, unsure if she had merely traded one cage for another. The journey to Elias Thorne's ranch was a long, silent passage through a landscape as stark and unyielding as the man himself. Dust plumed behind his steady horse, a fine, gritty veil that settled over Leanne, clinging to her thin clothes, her hair. She rode on a small, gentle mare he'd procured from the livery, her hands clutching the pommel so tightly her knuckles were white. Fear was a cold knot in her belly, a constant companion that had shadowed her for months. She expected brutality, the casual violence she had come to associate with men of this new, harsh land. Yet, Elias Thorne kept his distance, riding a few paces ahead, his back straight, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He never looked back, never spoke, save for a gruff "water" when they stopped by a narrow, willow-choked creek. He offered her a canteen, his calloused fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second, a touch devoid of menace, almost impersonal. Leanne drank, the cool water a small solace in the oppressive heat and her own swirling terror. His ranch was a solitary speck in an ocean of waving grass and distant, purple-shadowed mesas. A small, sturdy cabin of weathered logs, a corral, a lean-to barn. It was a place of profound isolation, the silence broken only by the sigh of the wind through the tall prairie grass and the distant cry of a hawk. There was a severity to it, a reflection of the man who called it home. When they arrived, he dismounted, his movements fluid and economical. He helped her down, his hand briefly on her elbow, a steadying pressure, nothing more. "Food inside," he said, gesturing towards the cabin. "You can take the bunk." "I'll use the barn." Leanne stared at him, uncomprehending. The bunk, a narrow bed built into the wall with a clean but patched quilt, was clearly his. She said nothing, her voice still locked away by trauma and suspicion. Inside, the cabin was sparse but surprisingly clean. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, a few shelves holding tins and sacks. He ladled stew from a pot simmering over a low fire into 2 bowls, placing one before her. He ate slowly, methodically, his gaze mostly on his food or out the small, square window. Leanne watched him, her fear warring with a dawning bewilderment. He made no demands, offered no threats. He moved with a quiet deliberateness, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he handled a chipped mug or stoked the fire. The first few days passed in a strange, suspended silence. Leanne stayed mostly in the cabin, a small, frightened creature in a new, unfamiliar den. She expected him to approach her, to claim what he had paid for. But he didn't. He rose before dawn, tended his few cattle, mended fences, worked the unyielding land with a tireless, solitary patience. He left food for her, fresh water in a bucket by the door. He spoke little, and when he did, it was practical, brief. Storm coming poor, need more. Leanne began to observe him more closely. She saw the way he soothed his horse, a low murmur in its ear. She saw the lines of weariness around his eyes deepen as the day wore on. She saw him pause sometimes, staring out at the vast emptiness, a profound loneliness etched on his face. He was a man acquainted with sorrow, she sensed, a man who carried burdens he did not speak of. One morning, she found a small, broken wooden bird by the hearth, clearly something he'd been whittling. Hesitantly, she picked it up. Its wing was snapped. Using a small knife she found, and a sliver of wood, she carefully, painstakingly, mended it. She left it on the table. When Elias came in that evening, he saw it. He picked it up, turned it over in his hands. He looked at her, a long, searching look. He said nothing, but a subtle shift occurred in the cabin's atmosphere, the easing of a tension she hadn't even fully realized was there. A few days later, she began to sweep the floor with a warm broom. Small acts, tentative offerings in the vast silence that lay between them. He would nod, a curt acknowledgement, but his eyes, she thought, held a different light. The fear hadn't vanished, but it was slowly, imperceptibly, being nudged aside by a fragile, nascent curiosity. This man, Elias Thorne, was not like the others. He was an enigma, a protector who demanded nothing, a savior whose kindness was as stark and unadorned as the land he inhabited. Weeks turned into a month, then 2, the rhythm of their days settling into a quiet pattern, as steady and unhurried as the turning seasons on the high plains. The silence between Elias and Leanne was no longer a wall of fear, but a space, still vast, yet holding the potential for understanding. Leanne, though still mostly wordless, moved with a little more ease within the confines of the small cabin and the yard around it. She had claimed a small patch of earth near the water barrel, turning the soil with a rusted spade Elias had left leaning against the barn. She found a few wild seeds, tucked them into the ground, tending them with a fierce, quiet devotion. It was an act of faith in a future she couldn't yet imagine, a tiny rebellion of life against the desolation she had known. Elias watched her sometimes, from a distance, as she knelt by her small garden, her dark hair falling over her face. He saw not that exotic flower Sweeney had tried to sell, but a resilience that mirrored the stubborn prairie grass, bending in the wind but never breaking. He found himself thinking of his own past, of the wife and child he had lost to fever and his own perceived helplessness, a failure that had driven him to this isolation, a self-imposed penance. He had bought Leanne, not for companionship, not for service, but from a sudden, raw impulse to snatch one soul from the gaping maw of cruelty he'd witnessed in the Gilded Spur. It was an act of defiance against a world that had taken too much from him. He hadn't known what he would do with her, this silent, wounded girl. He only knew he couldn't leave her to them. One day, while Elias was mending a harness, Leanne approached him, holding out one of his worn shirts. A button was missing. She held up a small, scavenged piece of polished river stone, shaped like a button, and a needle threaded with coarse twine. Her eyes questioned him. He nodded, a gruff, "Go on." She sat on the cabin step, her small hand surprisingly deft as she sewed the makeshift button onto his shirt. It was a simple act, yet it felt like a stitch mending something far deeper than fabric. Later that week, a lone rider, a trapper named Silas who occasionally passed through, stopped for water. Elias spoke with him briefly, his back to the cabin. Leanne, inside, overheard snippets of their conversation, carried on the wind. Ballo and his bunch. Still saw. Talking ugly. About that Chinawoman you bought, her breath hitched. Bad talk. She knew what that meant. When Silas had ridden off, Elias came inside. He found Leanne standing by the window, her small frame rigid. Her voice, when it came, was a mere whisper, rusty from disuse, the words heavily accented but clear. They talk bad. Elias turned, his expression unreadable. He looked at her for a long moment. Ain't there concern, he said finally, his tone firm. This is our place. They got no say here, but the words, meant to reassure, hung in the air, a premonition. The peace they had found was fragile, an oasis in a desert of prejudice. That evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the vast sky, Leanne was tracing patterns in the dust on the floor with her finger. Elias watched her. She drew a flower, a simple, 5-petaled bloom, then a bird, then a shape that looked like a character from her own language. She glanced up, saw him watching, and quickly smoothed the dust clean. But he had seen it, a fleeting glimpse into the world she carried within her, a world of beauty and memory, buried deep beneath layers of trauma. He knew then that the $50 he'd paid was nothing, her survival, her quiet unfolding, was a treasure beyond price, and a responsibility that settled deeper into his solitary heart. The wind picked up that night, a mournful sound that seemed to carry the distant whispers of trouble. The sky had been a bruised purple for days, the air thick and heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. Then the storm broke, not with gentle rain, but with the violence of a cornered beast. Wind howled around the small cabin, rattling the shutters Elias had secured, and rain lashed down in sheets, turning the hard-packed earth into a slick, treacherous mud. It was a mirror to the turmoil brewing, a physical manifestation of the darkness gathering on their horizon. Inside, Leanne stoked the fire, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the log walls, making the small space feel both a sanctuary and a cage. Elias stood by the window, peering out into the maelstrom, his face a grim mask. He'd seen the riders earlier, distant figures half obscured by the dust kicked up by the wind, heading their way. Jed Barlow and his cronies. He knew they were coming. The fragile peace was about to be shattered. The pounding on the door, when it came, was hard, insistent, nearly drowned out by the thunder. Elias didn't flinch. He just turned, his hand resting near the old Spencer rifle propped against the wall. "Stay back," he told Leanne, his voice low and steady, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. He unlatched the door, opening it just enough to see Barlow's rain-slicked, malevolent face, flanked by 3 other men, their expressions a mixture of drunken bravado and mean-spirited intent. "Thorn," Barlow sneered, rain dripping from his hat. "We come for what's ours. Or rather, what should have been." The Chinawoman Elias's frame filled the doorway. "She ain't property, Barlow. And she ain't yours. Best you ride on out before this storm gets worse, or you do." One of Barlow's men, a lanky youth with shifty eyes, laughed. "Listen to him. Actin's like she's a real lady." Barlow pushed forward. "We paid for a bit of fun, Thorn. You cheated us. Now we're here to collect, or get our money back with interest." "You ain't getting either," Elias stated, his voice flat, cold as the wind. "Leave." Now from behind him, Leanne watched, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The terror was back, icy and familiar. But as she saw Elias stand firm, a lone bulwark against their ugliness, something else stirred within her, a hot surge of defiance, a desperate courage she didn't know she possessed. These men, with their cruel eyes and mocking laughter, they would destroy the small, tentative sprout of safety she had found here. They would defile not just her, but the quiet decency Elias had shown her. Barlow tried to shove past Elias. Elias didn't move, solid as an oak. "Last chance, Barlow, get him!" Barlow roared, lunging. The fight exploded in the cramped space of the doorway, spilling out into the storm. Elias moved with a brutal efficiency, his fists like iron. He was 1 man against 4, but he fought with the fury of a man defending his last bastion of hope. Rain and mud made the ground treacherous. A blow caught Elias on the side of the head, and he staggered. One of the men grabbed a heavy piece of firewood. Leanne screamed, a raw, piercing sound that cut through the roar of the storm. As the man raised the wood to bring it down on Elias's exposed back, Leanne acted. She didn't think. She snatched the heavy iron poker from the hearth, its tip still warm, and with a desperate cry, lunged forward, swinging it with all her might at the man's legs. It connected with a sickening thud against his shins. He howled in pain, dropping the firewood and stumbling, his balance lost in the slick mud. The distraction was enough. Elias recovered, spinning, and delivered a punishing blow to Barlow's jaw, sending him sprawling. The other 2, seeing their leader down and their companion incapacitated by a scrawny Chinawoman, lost their nerve. The fight was too hard, the storm too wild, Thorn too fierce, and the girl wasn't the passive victim they'd imagined. Elias, breathing heavily, blood trickling from a cut above his eye, stood over Barlow. "Get up. And get out. If I ever see you or your curs near this place again, the storm will be the least of your worries." Barlow, clutching his jaw, scrambled to his feet, his bravado gone, replaced by a sullen, hateful fear. He and his remaining men dragged their injured companion away, disappearing into the raging tempest like the vermin they were. Elias watched them go, then slowly turned back to the cabin, leaning heavily against the door frame. Leanne rushed to him, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fierce concern. The poker clattered from her trembling hand. The storm raged on outside, but inside the small cabin, something had irrevocably shifted. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation was a raw, aching silence within the cabin, punctuated only by the relentless drumming of rain and the howl of the wind. Elias sagged against the doorframe, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the adrenaline ebbing away to reveal the pain of his injuries. Blood dripped from the gash above his eye, mingling with the rain on his face. Leanne, her own terror momentarily forgotten, moved towards him, her earlier fear now eclipsed by an urgent, overwhelming need to help. She touched his arm hesitantly, her small hand surprisingly steady. "You are hurt," she whispered, her voice still shaky but clear. He looked down at her, his grey eyes clouded with pain but also a dawning wonder. He'd seen her, a flash of desperate courage in the storm, a small, fierce protector. He managed a faint, grim smile. "Just a scratch, Leanne," but it was more than a scratch. He was bruised, bleeding, and the way he favored his ribs spoke of deeper hurts. Gently, she guided him to one of the chairs by the fire. Her earlier timidity was gone, replaced by a quiet competence. She fetched a clean cloth and a basin of water, her movement swift and purposeful. Kneeling before him, she began to clean the cut above his eye, her touch surprisingly gentle, her brow furrowed in concentration. The small cabin, lit by the flickering firelight, felt intensely intimate. The storm outside was a raging beast, but within these four walls, a profound connection was being forged in the crucible of shared danger. As she tended his wounds, Elias watched her. He saw the strength in her delicate features, the unwavering resolve in her dark eyes. This was the woman they had sought to break, to dehumanize. And they had failed. Utterly. "You were brave," he said, his voice hoarse. She paused, looking up at him, her eyes searching his. "You fight." "For me fought for us," he corrected, his gaze holding hers. "This is our home." A small, almost imperceptible tremor went through her. "Our home." The words resonated deep within her, a balm to old wounds. When she had cleaned his cuts, she found an old shirt and tore it into strips for bandages. Her hands worked deftly, binding his ribs where a kick had landed, her touch firm yet comforting. The silence between them now was different from before. It was no longer a chasm of unspoken fears, but a shared space of understanding, of mutual reliance. The ordeal had stripped away the last vestiges of their guardedness. As the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the shuttered window, the storm outside finally began to subside. The wind softened its howl to a mournful sigh, and the rain gentled to a steady patter. A profound stillness settled over the land, washed clean. Leanne rose and went to the window, unlatching a shutter. The air that drifted in was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of wet earth and bruised sage. The rising sun painted the broken clouds in hues of rose and gold. A new day. A new beginning. She turned back to Elias. He was watching her, a faint smile on his lips. And then, Leanne did something she hadn't done in what felt like a lifetime. She smiled. A true, radiant smile that transformed her face, chasing away the shadows of fear and sorrow, revealing an inner light that was breathtaking. "Wo Jiao Lian," she said softly, clearly. "My name is Lian." He nodded slowly, his own smile deepening. "I know, Lian. I know." The years that followed were etched not by grand events, but by the quiet rhythm of seasons, of shared work, and of a love that grew as strong and resilient as the ancient cottonwoods by the creek. The small patch of earth Leanne had first tended blossomed into a vibrant garden, a splash of color and life against the stark beauty of the plains. Laughter, once a stranger to the cabin, became a familiar sound. Elias's solitude was filled, not just by Leanne's presence, but by her spirit, her quiet strength, her unwavering love. The scars of their past remained, but they were no longer sources of pain, but reminders of the battles they had fought, and won, together. The townsfolk, and the few scattered neighbors, came to see them differently. They saw not an outcast rancher and his foreign woman, but a man and a woman who had carved out a life of dignity and peace in a harsh land, their bond a silent testament to the enduring power of the human heart. Elias Thorne had paid $10 for what the world deemed worthless, but in Leanne, he had found his redemption, his home, his heart. And Leanne, stolen and sold, had found not a master, but a partner, a protector who saw her soul, and in his quiet strength, she had found the courage to reclaim her own. Their love story was a quiet melody played against the vast, wild backdrop of the frontier, a testament to the fact that even in the deepest darkness, hope could take root and blossom. If this story stirred something in your soul, if you believe that true worth is often hidden beneath the surface, and that love can indeed conquer prejudice and heal the deepest wounds, then you're in the right place. We believe in the power of stories that uplift the human spirit, that find courage in the desolate places, and celebrate the resilience of outcasts who find their strength in unexpected connection. If you crave more tales of redemption, of unlikely bonds, and of love that fights back against the odds, then subscribe now. Become part of a community that cherishes stories where the broken become whole, and where the quietest hearts speak the loudest truths. There are many more journeys to share,